Campus FM presents Richard Stedall. Good morning, Richard.
Good morning on this rather hot and sticky day.
Indeed, and Paul Gallia as well. Good morning, Paul.
Lord Wataiba. Good morning.
Good morning, exactly. Paul, of course, is a researcher and expert in the story of the Malta Railway and also the Malta Tramway and various other modes of transport and historic artifacts in Malta, particularly related to the late 19th century and early 20th century. Richard is a researcher and expert about the public transport system, the buses. Paul introduced me to Richard, and now we've been quite a few weeks doing a series about the history of Maltese transport. We're in the 70s, 80s and 90s of the story of the Maltese public transport system, thanks to Richard. So Richard, can I leave it to you to take us back in your little time machine to the early 1970s?
Certainly. And as you say, yes, this week, 1970s, 1980s and 1990s. 3 decades which saw a lot of changes happen to the bus industry. So we'll take each decade as they come. So yes, the 1970s, probably the biggest change that happened that decade was in the kind of sort of autumn of 1973, when the route liveries that had been in use since 1931 were all replaced. So up until that point, each route or group of routes going to a particular village or group of villages had their own colour, normally with a white roof, and then there's a dark blue for Rabat, dark green for Slima, and so on.
Very colourful.
Very colourful.
Old postcards. They're very, very sweet.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. So what happened was, in 1973, all these routes were merged into 3 operating groups, known as Group A, Group B, Group C. And what they did was they chose 3 of the existing liveries to be the liveries of those groups. So Group A was red. That was the old Birkirkara livery, and that covered, as well as the old Birkirkara route, things like buses heading towards Rabat and kind of the south part of the island. Mm-hmm. Group B used the white.
Well, we Maltese call the south actually the other side, Massa Schlock. So more like southwest.
Geographically, the south. Of the
yeah. Southwest, maybe.
Yeah.
Western. Mm-hmm.
Group B was used the white and blue livery of the Memorja route. Mm-hmm. And that covered the north and northwest of the island. So, as well as the Memorja route, you're looking at the Mosta and Nashar route, the Slima route,
St. Paul's Bay.
Yeah, so all of that became Group B in white with a blue band. And then Group C took on the spray green livery that had been used on the Cospicua route, and that basically covered pretty much the whole of the eastern end of the island.
When you say they decided on these 3 main groups, yes. Is it still the Malta Traffic Board or that thing you mentioned last week?
It would have been sort of the Traffic Control Board, the Maltese government. They were looking at trying to introduce reforms. One of the problems that had existed was that certain key routes, such as the Slima route, the Birkirkara route, made a lot of money. A lot of the smaller, more rural routes made very little money for the owners and things. So what they wanted to try and do was, by putting all of these routes into groups, it meant that any one owner, their bus, was allocated to that larger group, so that they would, over the course of a year, do a mix of profitable and less profitable work.
Sounds fair.
So that was just it. And in fact, what then happened was, a couple of years later, in 1975, all the buses went that light green colour. And the intention was at the time that everything would go into just one operating company, so that even more so there would be, over the course of a year, a fair sharing out of all the work.
And rotation.
However, it took until about 1977 for the structure behind it all to actually change. And that's around about when the Operators Association, ATP, was set up. The shareholders being all the owners, so each owner
sort of cooperative, wasn't it?
That's just it. Kind of sort of that structure of ATP and the owners and buses and so remained then until 10 years ago in 2011.
And it's very important to point out, for those maybe who haven't been listening since the beginning, and also perhaps international listeners, that each bus was owned by the driver or a family, or it was sort of, it wasn't like the drivers drove the buses on behalf of the government or a national company, right?
No, that's just it. You had a number of people who were owner drivers, and then there were a number where, especially if the owner owned more than one bus or was a general businessman and had invested his money in buying up buses and then employing some drivers. But on the whole, yes, it was the small businessman, as effectively. You can't get much smaller businessman than someone who owns their own bus and is the driver of it. Late 70s was also when they introduced, in theory, the roster of working day on, day off. Although again, you always ended up with swaps taking part and buses being off the road, so they'd need to get somebody else in or something. But yes, they would work very long hours. The jokes would be the fact that the bus was part of the family. Indeed, it's a case of I think probably some drivers' wives and things felt the fact that the bus was more part of the family than they were, because the guy spent far more time with the bus than he did with her, type thing. So that was kind of sort of one of the first big changes of the 70s. What we also then saw in the mid 70s were around about a dozen buses went from Malta over to Gozo. There was a need for more buses on Gozo as tourism just started to sort of take off there and things. And then we saw also in the mid 70s the arrival of 4 Chinese built buses. Now, it's a case of people might think that the era of Chinese built buses started in 2003.
That's what I thought, the King Long.
When the first King Longs arrived.
Hilariously named King Long buses.
Indeed. But no, what had happened was there were these 4 Chinese buses and a couple of minibuses came. They were left-hand drive, petrol engines. And what it was, they were brought over for workers using to build the new dry dock. I think it was dock number 6.
Yes, also called the Red China dock at the time. Of course.
So it's a case of they bought these buses over, built in, I believe, Shanghai, and brought over to use. And then around about 1981, they were sold on to the Public Works Department. But how much use they then saw into the 80s, I don't know. They all ended up being scrapped.
And do pictures exist of these buses?
There are a couple, mostly thanks to some English bus historians and bus fans who came over in the late 70s.
Were the Chinese at the time, like the Koreans, still building copies of European vehicles, or was it their own design?
No, they were quite sort of basic designs of their own. It's only in much more recent times that you've seen sort of copies of kind of sort of German and European designs being built there. So they were quite basic buses. Quite basic petrol engines and things as well. So that was one of the things. And then we also saw in the latter half of the 1970s a internal minibus service start up going around Valletta. Now, that's actually something that back in the late 20s, early 30s, I believe the businessman Joseph Gazan actually put in an application to the government that he wanted to use much smaller buses and do a circuit that went around the streets of the city. Obviously, full-size buses are way too big to go up and down the streets and things. And at the time, he was told by the government, no, there's no need for it and things. And it took until the late 70s that we then saw this minibus service start up.
That's a very good idea.
White minibuses with a red band. They loaded on the bridge leading into the city gate, so just by the main bus station. We know very, very little about it. There was a couple of articles in the Times of Malta at the time. I've come across one or two photographs, but even the transport historians and transport fans who were coming over from the UK, taking hundreds of photographs and bits and pieces, they basically ignored them because what they came over to see were the classic full-size Maltese buses. They weren't interested in these little minibuses.
So already by the 70s, the Maltese buses were starting to be considered by, for example, British transport historians as something unique.
Oh, yes. You had up sort of the 50s and early part of the 60s, the only sort of transport fans that came really from the UK were people who worked in the military, worked for the Navy, worked for the RAF, and were based here. And they would bring their camera and take some photos. But actual kind of sort of leisure travellers, it's the 60s before we started to see those.
Yes.
And really, properly, it was the 70s when, you started getting a couple of people coming over, making detailed notes, talking to the drivers and the conductors to try and find out what some of these buses were. Literally, I know of one guy, he would come over and he would crawl under the buses trying to identify the chassis from what was underneath and things. So luckily we started to sort of get some photos. But as I say, these minibuses, virtually nothing. So I'm going to put an appeal out now. If there is anybody listening who either has photographs of these minibuses, or better still, was the driver or an owner of one of these minibuses in the late 70s, the Malta Bus Archive would desperately love to hear from you.
So 70s minibuses that operated in Valletta.
Yes, yeah. As I say, they were white with a red band, and I think it sort of said Valletta Martinshett down the side of it. But they were a mixture of imported sort of Morris J2 minibuses, and there were a couple of locally built buses built on sort of old Bedford MW lorry chassis from the military, and bodied to look a little bit like sort of miniature full-size buses. In fact, a friend of mine's recently rescued one for preservation, and we're just trying to confirm at the moment exactly what number it used to be. But because there aren't any photos at the moment, we've hit a little bit of a dead end. But hopefully, if any of our listeners have got photos, or as I say, if anyone, either you used to drive it or your father or grandfather used to drive one of the minibuses, or you know of someone who used to, please do get in contact, and at the end of the programme we'll give all the contact details.
But they can easily find the Malta Bus Archive on social media, YouTube,
Facebook,
Campus Brunch Facebook page. We're talking to Richard Stedall, who's a researcher at the Malta Archives, about the history of Malta bus transport, the public transport system in Malta. Also in the studio is Paul Gallia, who's a big researcher as well in this field, particularly though he's more of an expert about the trains and the tramways that we had in Malta up to the 1930s. However, Paul remembers the era we're talking about today, the 70s, for example. Paul, some recollections of your own from the 1970s, the changes that started happening then?
Right. One thing I remember for sure in the 70s was way back in 1972, when Malta turned decimal. And for the decimalization, the Department of Information wanted to film a production to explain to people the difference it's going to make. you travel on the bus paying with the old currency, with the old sterling, obviously 2 shillings, half a crown, 6 pence, 3 pence, etc., and paying with the new currency, the decimal currency.
You get your change in the new currency? Is that how it worked?
No.
Oh.
They switched completely.
Okay.
And I was asked to be part of the film, take part of the film. With my involvement, I mean, my dad was with DOI and all. And I remember the person responsible, the producer, was Carmenazzo Pardi.
Oh, the famous
actress.
Okay, Carmen. Okay.
She she was the head of the film unit of the department.
Okay, all right.
And she said, Carmelo, your son, Paul, he's a teenager, he would be adequate. And I was, so that I cannot forget. And we operated and filmed on the Vittoriosa route, on the green, light green buses.
Was this the decimalization? This would be an interesting subject to discuss in the future, perhaps during one of our summer editions. Nothing to do with transport, just in general. But I remember the change from Maltese lira to the euro, which wasn't so painful. I think there was so much effort put into explaining it that it passed quite relatively harmlessly. Was the changeover to decimalization also very easy? It was very difficult, was it?
No.
Oh.
I mean, the mentality was that people weren't prepared to change. I always ask, are you ready to change?
Yeah, well, it's hard, isn't it?
And, we had numbers of years, decades of years, where you still went to a greengrocer and she's doing your bill in pounds, shillings and pence.
Yes.
Jesus. And then they had to be converted, and then to give you the change, she converted the change. It
was quite complicated. We'll discuss it on its own. Maybe we bring some
Otherwise,
few historians
the buses,
in.
the color of the buses.
Ah, yes.
For us Maltese, we were accustomed to it. Foreigners enjoyed
all those colors.
It was carnival time all year round, sort of. But the color denoted the destination of that bus. When it came to numbers, people started complaining about if the number is too big or too small, they should be lit, they should be this, and they should. And remember, these were the same buses which we had before. I mean, they did some alterations here and there to hold a nameplate of the destination and all. But because people weren't prepared to just have the number without having the written destination as
they wanted it spoon-fed. They wanted it given to them on a plate.
We have always been spoiled.
Okay, so there was a bit of trauma. Okay, so we're towards the end of the 70s. Richard, do tell us more about your research.
Okay, so the last kind of sort of thing from the 1970s that I wanted to mention was quite a seismic change for the industry, and that was the demise of the traditional bus conductor. Now, since the 1920s, the very first buses, there had been bus conductors on board, quite often relatively young boys, sometimes the son or the nephew of the driver or the owner, and their job had been to collect the fares and issue the tickets on the bus. All the bus driver had to do was literally drive the bus. But during the 70s, costs were rapidly rising. There was obviously the Middle East crisis, which meant fuel costs went through the roof. The government was very reluctant to increase the bus fares that were charged.
So the fuel costs for drivers and bus owners went through the roof, like they did all over the world. Of course,
that's just it. Fuel prices, and then associated prices. It's not just fuel. Lubricant oil prices would have gone through the roof. Prices for things like tyres would have gone through the roof and things. So there was a growing sort of industrial relations problem between the owners, the drivers, and the government,
which wanted to keep the ticket prices the same.
Well, that's just it. You know, from an inflationary point of view, for dealing with the point of view of the general public,
yes.
You know, everybody was seeing prices increase. What the government wanted to try and do was keep things that were under their control at a set level. But in the end, what happened was the government turned around and said to the owners that the only way that we can increase the amount of money that effectively you have or the drivers have is to get rid of the conductors, so that rather than that money, the fare money, paying for both the driver, the conductor, and then potentially some to the owner if that was somebody different.
Yes.
The conductor was taken out of the equation, and it therefore meant more money could go in. But what it did therefore mean is that the drivers had to do all the handling of the money and the selling of the tickets and that sort of thing. So it actually slowed the journeys down.
Of course. And also it was the birth of the famous Addu Naqra al-Jawahi, move back, because the driver had to control not just the bus but also you know, annoying people who stayed towards the front and take, you know, there was plenty of space in the back but it wasn't taken up, etc. And then the driver would get frustrated.
But it did mean also that the traditional buses had like a decorated wooden cabin around the driver's position. In fact, it was mandatory that wooden. It was mandatory the partition had to be there. It wasn't mandatory that it had to be decorated as it was though. But what therefore happened was most of these cabins were ripped out of the buses because the only way the driver could turn around and physically deal with it, because obviously most of them the entrances were behind the driver, so he was going to have to physically turn around to deal with the passengers. And
indeed.
things. So most of these cabins disappeared as well. So, but as I say, it did lead to some very large scale industrial disputes. Probably one of the largest was in sort of late 1980, early 1981. The government again were trying to sort of modernise the industry, and were bringing in fully built up second-hand buses from the UK. First batch being the ex-London AEC Swifts. And the way...
They're the ones with the very flat
fronts. Yeah, and sort of seated around about sort of 46 passengers and things. And I
remember thinking as a child, because I was a very young child at the time, and the first time I saw one of these buses, they had two round headlamps in the front, but they also had a round lamp at the back for a reversing light, but it looked like a headlamp. So I thought, do these buses go both ways?
But the problem was the fact that the way that the government was looking to supply these buses to owners, and the financial terms that they were looking to do it, was very, very unpopular. So as I say, there was this all-out strike, and what the government did was initially use these buses as strike buster buses, still in the red London livery, still with UK registration plates on. Police buses were used, military lorries were used, anything to sort of just try and get people moving and things.
It was it also happened to be a very tense year, 1981, for various other reasons. And so it's one of those watershed years that historians really need to focus on and look at the story. There's plenty to write about, I think, that year. Paul?
And there are just quickly, there are reports of shots actually being fired at the buses, the strike-busting buses at the time.
Wow.
But yeah, Paul.
For youths, it was fun, huh?
Was it?
I mean, yes, helping all helping all the ladies up to the lorries, to the especially the RL ones. You know, I mean, they were quite
high up.
And
you mean the younger ladies?
Yes.
I mean, helping old ladies is a very Scout's honor type thing.
We always left the old senior citizens, the female senior citizens, to be handled by the able military people.
Okay. Good one, Paul. But okay, Richard,
Yep, so we're kind of sort of now into the early 1980s. More second-hand buses continued to arrive from the UK, and as we get towards sort of 84, 85, 86, a lot more of these second-hand vehicles are actually coaches, midlife coaches. And we talked last week of the famous duple dominant that you would see on the front of the bus. Well, a lot of these were built on sort of Bedford and Ford coach chassis, and they had either the duple dominant bodywork, or there was the Plaxton version, the Plaxton Supreme or the Plaxton Elite. And by the end of the 1980s, it meant that around about a third of the fleet had been replaced. So traditionally there was just over 500 vehicles. So
and I would think that these coaches that were imported, they were the first air-conditioned ones.
No,
no, they weren't.
No. Well, the thing was, at the time there were also similar vehicles, but slightly longer ones, being imported to update the coach fleet, the unscheduled fleet.
Oh, the Il Privates.
They did have air conditioning fitted to them. Oh. But the ones that were painted in green and used as route buses, no air conditioning. Oh. At the time, no opening windows other than the roof hatches.
The flap, yes. And that would have caused them unrest and sort of mumblings.
They were very, very hot this time of the year.
Criticism, yes.
As the years went on, increasingly they did have sliding windows fitted to them and things which did help. But as I say, around about a third of the fleet was replaced, and a lot of the normal control vehicles, the ones that had the engine sticking out the front with the bonnet, a lot of those disappeared. There were still a few left into the 90s.
The cutest ones.
yeah. But I said that the coach fleet was also being updated as well. Traditionally, the coach, the unscheduled buses, because there wasn't a lot of quality difference between an unscheduled bus and a route bus, but they'd been painted cream with a white roof. And what happened again in the mid-80s was that as these better quality coaches started to arrive, the Operators Association for the unscheduled vehicles wanted to try and differentiate between the better quality vehicles and the effectively just the old style buses. Mm-hmm. So what they did was, for the better quality ones, they added blue, light to mid blue to the cream, and within a few years, all of the older vehicles that were just in the cream livery had gone, and then everything was in light blue and cream for a while.
I remember that cream colour. Yes, the private buses.
So the only other thing I'm going to just briefly mention about the 80s is the fact that it was quite a confusing time if you were trying to follow the history of vehicles, if you were looking at their registration plates, because across about a 5-year period, the plates changed 3 times. So from when the very first registration plates were introduced by the Malta Police around about 1908, 1909, they'd been purely numerical. White number on a black plate.
Black plate, yes.
That continued all the way through until 1979, 1980.
Yes. By
which time the numbers, what would happen is, numbers would get reused, but they would also issue new numbers in the sort of in sequential thing, and the kind of new numbers was getting up to the mid to high 90,000s. So a decision had to be made. Did they start using 6-digit numbers, or did they introduce a different system? And what they did was they introduced a different system. And that's where the one letter followed by up to 4 digits. Yeah,
with a dash in between and an M in a circle on the right.
So that started in 1980. And from the point of view of the buses, it was nice and easy. Pretty much what they just did was they put an A in front of whatever the number had been. So if the bus number had been 1234, in the old scheme, it became A1234. And it was on a white plate with black lettering, so they kind of sort of reversed it. But very quickly in 1982, they then decided, no, they wanted to introduce, for buses, coaches, taxis, hire cars and that sort of thing, a completely separate system. So they introduced the famous red plates. That started with a Y.
Of course.
And what they did was, initially, buses and coaches were numbered from sort of 1,000 upwards, and taxis and hire cars were below 1,000. And then for some reason in 1984-85 they decided to swap that round. So then the buses and the coaches started from 300 upwards, the hire cars and the taxis were kind of sort of 1,000 upwards, and they then also introduced the minibus series, and that's when all the minibuses started being painted red with a white roof.
Of course.
And they were numbered 2,000 upwards in the Y series.
Okay.
So in the course of, as I say, 5 years, all the buses changed their plates 3 times. But it does mean the fact that when you're trying to date photographs, it's pretty easy to go,
Of course.
you know, that's between 1980 and 82, that's between 82 and 84, 85, and that's after 85, or those are before 1980.
And there's a bit of an aside here for our listeners as well. Paul will back me up on this. There was a very brief period where hire cars had a black and white check pattern on the side. They had a kind of sticker, black and white, like the Metropolitan Police in London type. But it was like along the side of the car for about a year or so. All hire cars had to have this sticker along the side to denote being hire cars.
It was an era where transport, all sorts of transport, it was something being done to be identified, like the blue sash at the back for vans, or red.
I think hire cars also got yellow number plates.
Yes,
at one point.
There were some yellow number
Yeah,
plates. For,
I think it's because of the rise of tourism. Like the early 80s saw a big rise in tourism numbers. So that was probably like something to do. That was probably involved in the decision making. That part of it.
yeah.
It was a control system, so which which the authorities haven't had in mind.
Yes. Richard?
Okay, so that pretty much sort of finishes the 80s. Obviously, as I'm going through these decades, I'm rattling through things. I'm not covering every single event and thing that happened in those decades, but it's just to sort of give listeners a flavour of what was happening. So we come into the 1990s, the last decade of the 20th century. There was far less fleet replacement going on at the time. However, what we did see were the first 5 low-floor buses arrive around about 96, 97 from the UK. Now, I actually came out on holiday with a friend in 96, and I remember reading in either the Times of Malta or one of the English language newspapers out here that one of the British bus builders was actually looking to open a factory out here to build 500 buses to replace every single bus that was in the route bus
Local fleet, yeah.
But nothing ever happened of that. And in the end, from the UK, there were just the 5 low-floor buses. An Optair, they were built in Leeds, and then 4 Dennis Darts. Now, Dennis, the chassis were built in Guildford in Surrey, just to the south of London, and then 2 had Plaxton bodies and 2 had East Lancs bodies.
You mentioned Dennis, the maker of lorries.
Yeah.
As a child, I used to think Dennis the Menace from the Beano when I'd see, was it rubbish trucks? The rubbish trucks in Malta, a lot of them were Dennis make.
And also fire engines.
And
they
fire
used to make
engines,
a lot
indeed.
of as
Indeed.
well,
I wonder if there's any fans of Dennis the make or here in Malta who has been collecting information about rubbish trucks in Malta. But anyway, do go on.
So what was actually unusual about the 4 Dennises were the fact that they were manual gearbox. Now, by then, pretty much everything that was being built in the UK was fully automatic gearbox. But it was deemed the fact that over here, they were a fully automatic gearbox was expensive to maintain. But B, or was it really kind of sort of up to the Maltese driving standards and roads and that sort of thing? So Dennis built these, and they were based on something similar that had been done for a company out in Hong Kong that was based on one of the very small islands. I think it was Lantau, and they had some very steep hills and narrow roads and things, and they wanted manual gearbox. So a few were built for there, and then these 4 were built for Malta, and they pretty much remained unique. But it was for sort of large scale fleet replacement with low floor buses, we had to wait another sort of 7 years until sort of about 2003-4, and we'll talk about that more next week. The other big change was 1995, and the colour of the buses changed.
Oh, yes.
So they had been green for 20 years, since 1975, when the three groups liveries were just merged down into one.
Yeah.
And the decision was taken to base the new livery for them on very similar to the old livery for the merged Zeebrugge and Segiri route. So it was a yellow bottom half of the bus, an orange band round the middle, and the orange band, depending on who painted it and bits and pieces, the shade changed. Sometimes it was a bit lighter, sometimes it was a bit darker, and things. And then obviously the traditional white roof and things. So that, and those buses were kind of repainted within a few weeks. But what you sometimes used to find was, because a lot of buses, I mentioned earlier, were working day on, day off, the owner would paint a bit of the bus on the day off, and then it would go out in a part finished way. So you'd sort of see buses that were maybe green one side, yellow the other, or still in undercoat or anything like that. Yeah. And it took the owner maybe a week or two to fully repaint the bus. Sadly, I wasn't out here that year when those changes were happening, but there were a few photographers who were, and there are some great photos.
They captured some of these camouflage buses.
And one guy took some great photos, again up on the city wall at Valletta, looking down onto the fountain and the bus terminus.
Yes.
And you see about half the buses are green, half the buses are yellow, and they're all sort of mixed up together. And to have got those sorts of shots, if he'd been a few weeks earlier or a few weeks later, he just wouldn't have happened.
Unique.
So,
yes. I remember the 1995, that the changing of the colour was meant to be the first step in a whole big bus reform, which never really happened at that point. It had to come 15 years later, and then we'll talk about that next week, because it wasn't exactly what didn't really. Let's put it this way: it had its issues.
Yes.
But 1995, there was meant to go much further than simply changing the colours, wasn't it?
Yeah. And then it's a case of the following year, 96 and into 97. The government decided, well, that's it. The registration plates had been stable and the same for about 12 years. Time to change everything again.
Yeah.
And
also with the eye on the EU.
So that's then when the EU style plates of 3 letters and 3 numbers appeared.
I remember.
And all the buses had were either DBY, EBY or FBY. The first letter denoting the month that the annual test and the insurance were due for renewal and things.
I see.
And then the coaches got CY plates, and the minibuses got MY plates, and so on. So once again, everything changed, and luckily, the last 3 numbers. So if the bus had been YO382 in the old system, it became DBY382 in the new system. So at least you had that continuity that you could still identify buses from one to the next type thing. So the last kind of sort of thing that I really want to sort of mention, we started talking about it last week, and that's the open top double deckers.
Oh yes.
Now 6 of those arrived in 1993. 3 with Supreme Travel in Zaytun, and 3 with Garden of Eden. But having arrived, permission for their use was refused, and a series of sort of lengthy court battles and that sort of thing by both of the operators started. And in the end, Supreme was allowed to start using theirs from 2007, 14 years later. And Garden of Eden had to wait about another 18 months until the very end of 2008 before they could start to use theirs. I mean,
I'm laughing, but it's ridiculous, but I'm laughing.
That's just it. They had spent, the vehicles that were imported, they had spent half their life sat here doing pretty much nothing. Although, having said that, you would very occasionally see one out in use, normally just after a general election.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's a case
Abusively.
of one operator tended to support one party, and the other operator tended to support the other party.
Yeah.
So whoever won one of the elections,
Yeah, they just...
you then see for just for a couple of hours one of these buses out with all the, and obviously they weren't licensed.
No, of course.
But bearing in mind the incoming government had just won an election type thing,
Yeah.
the authorities tended to turn a blind eye just for that day.
Yeah,
type
just
thing.
like they
So-
did for all the unlicensed cars and junk vehicles with spray paint all over them. Yeah.
Let's say it suited them best that way.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's just it.
And people like sitting on bonnets and cars driving around at 60 miles an hour. Yeah.
So as I say, those buses they sat in their respective garages pretty much for 14, 15 years.
Gosh.
And then eventually both operators were given permission to start using them for tours. And obviously the fleets have grown significantly since then.
No, I can understand that there might have been objections to their use in Malta, considering the size of the roads and trees, buildings, whatever, lamps. But it's just, does it need to take so long for a decision to be made?
No.
I mean, that's the problem, and not just in this situation. But of course, that's a totally different story.
Yes.
So,
but that probably kind of sort of roughly finishes up the 20th century. So what we'll do is next week, on the Monday, we will look at the 21st century. But what we will, on the Monday, we will specifically ignore the events of 10 years ago, July 2011, because what we'll then do is on the extra one we're doing on Friday, we will specifically cover what happened in 2011, as that will be to the day, the 10th anniversary of the last day of the old buses, so 2nd of July. And we will have a special guest with us as well, but more about that next week.
Indeed. So we'll talk again in a week's time, and that'll be the 28th of June, Richard. And then on the Friday, 2nd July, we'll have a sort of extra edition to conclude this whole saga.
Indeed.
And we'll talk specifically about the changeover on the 10th anniversary.
On exactly to the day. It was a Saturday 10 years ago, but it was the 2nd of July, and that was the last day.
Yes.
And then on the Sunday, on the 3rd of July, that's when Arriva took over. So.
Yeah. Paul?
Richard, if I may ask one question.
Of course.
Do you have any idea what really happened to the two Comer buses, which belonged to the British European Airways way back, which had been lying at one of the old parks at the old airport?
Ah, yes. So the buses that Paul's talking about were rather unique in looking, in as much the fact that the front half of it looked like just a normal single decker, and then the back half of it was built up almost a sort of double deck bus height. And what that meant was at sort of first ground level type thing at the back, you had a big luggage area, so the seating upstairs was over the luggage area. And there were two of these buses that ran between the airport and Valletta from the late 40s.
Actually, what the role, correct me if I'm wrong, was if you were flying BA to London, you did not go to the airport to check in. Your check-in was done at the Phoenicia Hotel.
Right. Yeah.
And then you were taken by these buses to the airport, and you just arrived not at the terminal building, just near the steps of the plane.
Ah, yes.
Originally.
Yeah. So you could go straight onto the...
I remember there were one or two others which belonged also to the RAF.
Yeah, the RAF had 3, and we don't know what happened to those. The 2 that were used for the airport, they ran until the late 60s and were then withdrawn. I know, talking to one guy who worked at the airport for years and years, he said he started working at the airport in the mid to late 70s. And he remembers at least one of them being dumped in a remote corner of the airfield, but they would have gone for scrap, sadly. But yeah, they were quite unique buses. And what I'll do is, when we do the audio visual version of this and we upload it to YouTube, I'll put a photograph of one on so that people can visualise what we're talking about.
Fantastic stuff. Thank you very much to Richard. Richard, quick reminder of where people can get in touch, especially if they have pictures of those small buses that did the Valletta in the 70s.
So the email address for the Malta Bus Archive is maltabusarchive, all as one word, at gmail.com. Or there is the Facebook group, and if you just search for Malta Bus Archive, you'll be able to find that and select to join. Or you can have a look at the YouTube channel, where you will find, as well as some video lectures, the audio-visual versions of these chats.
Of these talks, yes.
Where I add some photographs and bits and pieces that enable people to sort of see and visualise what we're actually talking about.
So, yes.
Yeah.
Fantastic. And I will also put a link to the Campus Brunch Facebook page of these audiovisual versions of these chats, so that they can access them from there. And your appeal was for those minibuses that went around Valletta in the 70s, operated by Gazani, I think you said?
No. Gazan originally wanted to do something similar in the late 20s.
Oh, okay.
Was told. But no, these would have been just little sort of owner-driven minibuses and things. White with a red band, and just ran kind of sort of down the length of the Valletta Peninsula and then back up a parallel street and things, and they went from just by the city gate.
So inter-Valletta buses, really.
That's it,
inside Valletta.
Internal service.
Internal service. Yeah. And your appeal is for pictures of these little buses.
That's just it. Or if there's someone that either you used to drive it, or a member of your family used to drive or own one of these vehicles, the Malta Bus Archive would love to hear from you. We want to try and find some more information about them.